we are witnessing, I think, a fundamental crisis in humanitarian action. Um, Aid is being politicized, access feels weaponized,
Yeah.
and the operating space, it just seems to be shrinking faster than ever.
It really does.
So the core question we have to dive into today is, can humanitarian neutrality, can it really survive the pressures of today's, well, polarized conflicts?
It's a huge question. And our mission here, I suppose, is to try and cut through some of that complexity, these humanitarian principles. You know, they sprang from the Red Cross movement's fundamental principles way back in 1965.
Right.
They aren't just like feel-good moral rules. They are, and the sources really show this clearly, they are the operational key for access, for survival in the field.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting with those foundational four. If you had to define them quickly, maybe not as a checklist, but based on their function in the field, where do we start?
You have to start with the ultimate why, right? Which is humanity. Yep. This is the non-negotiable moral anchor, the duty to address human suffering, protect life and health, respect the human being. It's the whole reason organizations even show up.
So if humanity is the why, then impartiality.
Yeah.
That dictates the who, doesn't it?
Exactly. Impartiality dictates action. It means you must base your assistance solely on need, prioritizing the most urgent distress and making, crucially, zero distinction based on things like nationality, race, or political opinions.
Zero distinctions.
Yeah. The moment you start prioritizing one group over another for anything other than urgent need, well, you've compromised the principle right there.
Okay. Then we arrive at the operational tightrope. Neutrality.
Neutrality is, you could call it strategic silence. Humanitarian actors, they must not take sides in hostilities or get drawn into political, ideological, or religious controversies.
To stay out of the fight.
It's the practical promise to stay out of the fight so you can actually help everyone involved.
And finally, the principle that feels like it's most under threat right now. Independence.
Independence.
Yeah.
This ensures autonomy. Your action, it has to be autonomous from the political, economic, or military objectives of any government or any other actor.
You can't be seen as a tool.
Exactly. Not a tool of foreign policy or stabilization efforts or counterterrorism. Without that clear independence, the other principles, they just crumble pretty quickly.
It's really vital, I think, for listeners to grasp that these four pillars aren't just, ethical standards on paper.
Not at all.
They are, as our sources emphasize again and again, practical tools for decision-making, for improving effectiveness, and critically, for securing acceptance on the ground. In high conflict zones, these principles, they're literally the difference between gaining access to, say, a starving population and getting kicked out, or worse, getting your staff killed.
And what's fascinating when you look at the sources is this pragmatic view. The principles guide who gets help, sure, but also, crucially, they reduce the risks of aid being misused or diverted. But, and this is important, they aren't always harmonious. The sources actually note they sometimes sit uncomfortably with one another.
How so?
Well, it forces difficult choices, like maybe accepting restricted access in the short term to maintain neutrality and independence, which you need for that long-term operational viability. It's a constant balancing act.
This brings us right to that core tension, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Is neutrality truly a principle anymore, or has it kind of morphed into just a high-stakes strategy, a tool?
Well, I think it functions as both. It definitely originates as a core principle of value, but in practice, it's probably the most valuable tool they have for securing humanitarian space.
Okay.
And to understand this, you need to look at the three dimensions of neutrality that organizations are constantly managing. First, the perception of the organization by all sides in a conflict.
Oh, they're seen.
Exactly. Second, their public positions, what they say or don't say. That's external neutrality. And third, the actual nature of their programs on the ground, internal neutrality. If you fail at any one of those, well, the operational space can just collapse.
And the immediate operational consequence, if you are perceived as non-neutral, it's often a lack of access, right, to the very people you're trying to help. Or maybe heightened insecurity risks for your staff.
Precisely.
Which is why I suppose some aid organizations find the idea of pure neutrality, where you refrain from all ideological controversy, almost unrealistic in today's world.
It's incredibly difficult, and the sources confirm this operational necessity. It's actually backed by law, international humanitarian law, specifically the additional protocols.
Ah, the legal angle.
Yes. It treats assistance that is clearly humanitarian and impartial as legally privileged. Offers of such relief cannot be regarded as interference or unfriendly acts.
So neutrality acts as a kind of legal safeguard.
It does. It provides a crucial legal firewall, if you like, around the
Yeah.
aid process itself. It protects that operational access.
Okay, that legal safety net sounds good. But it brings us right back to that moral tightrope walk, because this is where modern conflicts, like Gaza or Sudan, apply immense pressure. When does that commitment to neutrality become, well, complicit silence in the face of mass atrocities?
This is the core ethical challenge, no doubt about it. And it's often raised most sharply by certain non-governmental organizations like some with French origins, Médecins Sans Frontières, for example.
MSF, yeah.
They sometimes see a really deep incompatibility between that strict operational neutrality and the demands for justice, for accountability.
I mean, I understand the pragmatic argument you stay silent to maintain access, but surely to the victim on the ground, silence just looks and feels like a betrayal, like you're abandoning them. How can the sources defend that choice? How can silence ever be the most humanitarian option?
Look, the ICRC's calculus here, as reflected in the sources, it's brutal, but it's pragmatic. Silence itself is not a principle.
No, that's key.
The decision to speak out, or not, is always assessed based on its efficiency, its effectiveness in achieving the primary principle of humanity.
So it's a cost-benefit analysis for human life.
In a way, yes. You have to weigh. Will public condemnation actually save more lives than the operational access I currently have? If speaking out means closing the door to helping thousands more, then remaining silent, as counterintuitive as it feels, might serve the higher principle of humanity in that specific, awful context.
So neutrality is truly a means to an end, the end being humanity, and it's never the end in itself.
Precisely. That's a very good way to put it. And in managing that public image, the external neutrality we mentioned, there's a very strict communication framework. Organizations have to avoid commenting on who is right or wrong in a conflict.
Right. No taking sides.
And also avoiding criticism of the means or methods a specific party is using to win the conflict.
Wow. So what can they comment on publicly then, if they see violations?
They have to focus strictly on the normative frameworks. So talk about international humanitarian law, human rights law, refugee law, the guiding principles for internally displaced people.
Stick to the rules.
Stick rigidly to that legal normative language. That's really the only mechanism they have to maintain external credibility and avoid being painted as an ideological player, especially now when every statement is amplified online.
The amplification effect. That brings us to another operational reality. The challenge for NGOs with dual mandates. You know, the ones that mix humanitarian relief with longer-term development work. That seems like a direct threat to consistency, to independence.
It is a huge challenge, yeah. Because development work, by its nature, often requires deep, sustained cooperation with, and sometimes direct support of, the state apparatus.
Which immediately compromises.
Independence. The very independence required for principled, impartial humanitarian response, especially in those protracted conflict settings. Many experts cited in the sources argue quite strongly that mixing these mandates should be strictly avoided to preserve the credibility of pure humanitarian actors.
Let's focus back on independence again for a second, because this feels like where state objectives are most actively blurring the lines today. We're seeing major powers explicitly linking aid to their politico-military strategies.
Absolutely. Independence is under immense strain. States are increasingly including humanitarian action in objectives like, say, stabilization, or worse, making aid subject to counterterrorism legislation.
Which directly impacts funding and operations.
Severely. The sources really highlight that operational independence is compromised the moment assistance gets linked to political, economic, or those historically rooted geopolitical priorities of the donor state.
So just to be clear, if a donor explicitly ties funding for an NGO to, let's say, a country's counterinsurgency effort, that aid organization, no matter its own mission, has basically lost its shield of independence.
In that instance, yes, absolutely. To maintain genuine autonomy, the organization needs financial independence. It needs donor conditionality that is proportionate and, critically, non-political. If the donor is attaching political strings, well, that organization is likely sacrificing one of the core principles, probably independence, just to get necessary funding. And that ultimately harms their ability, and potentially others, to secure access down the line.
So since these principles, as you said, sometimes conflict, forcing organizations to prioritize one over another,
Right.
What's the overarching risk if any one organization decides to compromise, even with good intentions?
The risk is systemic. It's collective. Compromising any principle, neutrality, independence, even impartiality if pushed it, can severely reduce access not just for that organization, but potentially for all others operating in that space.
Because it erodes trust.
It erodes the fundamental perception of neutrality and independence across the board. It makes all aid actors look suspect in the eyes of warring parties or communities. The sources really stress that minimizing this risk requires constant, collective, institutional dialogue among all stakeholders, talking about where the lines must be drawn.
And underpinning all these efforts, whether they're prioritizing access or protecting independence, there's that essential complementary principle we really must mention. Do no harm.
Yes, do no harm. It's like the operational safety mechanism. It mandates preventing or at least alleviating any adverse consequences of your own actions on the affected populations.
So aid itself shouldn't make things worse.
Exactly. Aid must be highly conflict sensitive. You have to constantly ask, is my project, even if delivered impartially, inadvertently exacerbating resource competition? Is it providing an unintended economic benefit to an armed group? And so you might be violating this critical principle. You have to ensure your staff are never perceived, even accidentally, as tacitly supporting one party to the conflict over another.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive, really getting into the operating manual, so to speak, of modern humanitarian work. To try and synthesize this for you, the listener, we've kind of established that humanity and impartiality, they form the moral compass, dictating why aid is given and for whom.
Right. The core values.
While neutrality and independence are the indispensable, perhaps more strategic, practical tools required to ensure how that life-saving assistance can actually be delivered safely and effectively.
Yes, I think that's a fair summary. And the crucial tension to maybe leave people thinking about lies in this legal gray area that states exploit. The sources point out something quite specific. International law states that when assistance is provided unilaterally, meaning, say, only to victims associated with one party to the conflict, that action is not necessarily contrary to the terms of humanitarian law itself. It might be legally permissible.
Wait, hang on. So a powerful state can legally flood an area with highly politicized, non-neutral aid, favoring one side?
That is the definition of the modern threat. It might meet the bare minimum legal standard in some interpretations, but it is absolutely not principled humanitarian action according to the framework we've discussed.
Wow.
So the provocative question becomes, if this kind of aid is legally permissible even when it's clearly non-neutral, how can the genuinely principled humanitarian actors ensure that this potentially vast wave of politicized state aid doesn't just irrevocably undermine the credibility, the trust, the acceptance earned by those very principled actors?
How do they protect that space?
Exactly. That blurring of lines between what is technically legal under IHL and what is truly principled humanitarian action. That, I think, is the greatest vulnerability humanitarianism faces today.
That is a staggering challenge for organizations trying to navigate these incredibly volatile zones. Thank you so much for guiding us through this essential analysis today.
My pleasure.
For our listeners, remember, knowledge is protection.